Well, good day, folks. Hope you're having a great one. I'm back to talk more about The Secret by Price. In this episode, I'm going to be taking on the Pilgrim. That's right, I'm looking for Prudence Pudenda. Who is Prudence Pudenda? On page 66 and page 67, we're introduced to the Pilgrim. This Pilgrim is scarcely a human, into which this does not stick her blue nose, sniffling for smut. So I'm just wondering if this happens to be the tabloid news industry of the 1980s. And in the tabloid news around 1980, you had such publications as Star magazine, you had National Enquirer magazine, and the Daily News, the Daily Mail. Before, for the younger people who are getting introduced to The Secret, in 1982, we did not have a news feed on Facebook. In 1982, you did not have constant communications of tabloid news and gossip coming your way. If you wanted that kind of information, you had to tune into a 5 minute program, if you will. Hey, Jeff, how's it going? Talking about The Secret. So, anyway, in 1982, if you wanted to get Hollywood gossip, gossip about politicians, and this kind of thing, you had to just look at the checkout aisle at the grocery store. And this is where most people got their information concerning tabloid news and that type of thing. Now, granted, the television media had expanded, but the appetite and the taste for gossip had not reached the level that it has today. Yeah, there was a few shows developing. I think maybe Inside Edition or some of those shows like that may have gotten their infancy towards the end of the 80s. But there was no, and there still is no mainstream gossip television programming, except on the internet, of course, where pretty much everything is just gossip. But before, in 1982, you had to look at certain places in order to get your information. And I actually believe that Prudence is Prudence Murdock. I think Prudence Prue is her nickname, Murdock McLeod O'Day, was born in 1958 as the daughter of News Corporation founder Rupert Murdoch's daughter. And I think that she, after her father purchased the tabloid news publishing company, News of the World, she was then educated at the Dalton School in Manhattan in New York. Uh, so I think that Prudence is getting us to Rupert Murdoch. And you may remember in the previous episode, I talked about me thinking that this Fox TV executive was Rupert Murdoch. Well, I'm now thinking that this is actually who we're talking about as being Prudence, because let's just look at the founding of Star Magazine. Now, if you went to the supermarket checkout counter in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, you had a few choices. You could either look at Star Magazine or you could look at the National Enquirer. Well, the National Enquirer had been around for many years, but Rupert Murdoch, who had purchased in like 1960, the 60s, the News of the World, which was the most well-known tabloid in England, had decided he needed to expand into the United States, and so he launched in 1974 the Star magazine. And again, it was an inexpensive supermarket tabloid. Is simply printed on newsprint, and the anyway, the idea was that he was going to compete with the other publications out there. And I spoke a little about Rupert Murdoch being from Australia. He was building this big media company, which was in its infancy back in the 1980s. We now know News Corp as being this huge conglomerate right now. Well, over time, the interest in these magazine publications kind of started to dwindle when shows like Entertainment Tonight and Hard Copy ended up getting a slot on television after the news segment. And so that's a little bit of the history of that. So National Enquirer is basically a magazine that has been on the newsstands for a really, really long time. And so you need to realize that the Inquirer was started by a couple of people who were proteges of William Randolph Hearst. And I think William Randolph Hearst will also be introduced into this book later on. And so I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about the Hearst publishing dynasty. If you read through the back of the book, you'll get the sense that the authors of this book had a pretty decent interest in the history of newsprint, the history of news, the history of writing. And you'll find that some of these puzzles are built around people like Hearst, Pulitzer, Murdock. We already know Rockefeller, and that there was an interest in this level of people. And you kind of get this sense because in the dedication of the book, he talks a little bit about how he really champions those, and they're championing human rights and they're championing freedom of speech. And so this whole issue of freedom of speech rights seems to be an interesting part. So an anecdote about the Inquirer magazine is that by 1952, the circulation of the Inquirer reached about 17,000 copies a week. And it was purchased by Generoso Pope Jr., the son of Generoso Pope, the founder of Tubercresso, New York's Italian language daily paper. Pope's son, Paul, alleged that the Luciano crime family boss, Frank Costello, provided Pope the money to purchase it in exchange for the promise to list lottery numbers and to refrain from any mention of mafia activities. And I mention this because this is maybe the introduction to Luciano crime family in New York, where we might eventually get to one of the players that had something to do with that family later on. The other thing is that it was salacious. It talked about New York Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr. And the fact that this one guy had Griffin, who was basically had to resign from a board of directors. So for the primary publisher of this book, all of this history would have probably been talked about within the family as he was growing up. And so I just think it's kind of interesting that all of that history of the Inquirer is put here. So in 1971, the owner, Pope, at this time, moved the headquarters from New York to Lantana, Florida. And it also started running a cartoon series about cars and drivers and some other items like that. The Inquirer got a major scoop with Elvis Presley, and I think he might be one of the, people that's talked about later on in the book. But here you get I guess what I'm saying, here's how you get a little bit of the connections in the book going. And so if you continue this along, at the time in the 70s and 80s, the owner of the National Enquirer is this Pope guy. And his widow's name is Lois, by the way, which is again another of those Lois, Louise, Lewis, etc. Eventually, I think eventually the two magazines merged, but I think what the Pilgrim is, or if the Pilgrim is not Prudence Murdock, it's the tabloid newspaper industry. And I think that is kind of maybe the Pilgrim. To a lesser extent, there was a magazine called Variety magazine, and it was started in 1905 by a guy by the name of Silverman. And it was, a New York publication. But I don't think this magazine actually did the tabloid gossip as much as some of the others. Uh, so the Hollywood Reporter started in 1930, and this was based upon Variety magazine, but it was set in the Hollywood area. Now, once you get into the Hollywood Reporter, you will then get into this whole triangle of gossip reporting that includes Hedda Hopper, Luella Parsons, and Sidney Scholasky. And you might also add the name Sheila Gordon to that mix. And so, in that vein, you may have found a connection to Hollywood again with the group of people that were reporting all of this information. And let's see. So the later on in the Pilgrim story, we start talking about sex, and we're talking about the fun of having sex, if you will. And I'm I don't know if Dr. Ruth Westheimer would have been on the radar screen back in 1980 and 81. Her show was very popular in 1983. And Dr. Ruth Westheimer always talked about how fun sex is. And she had a call in show in New York, which then became a syndicated radio program. And, there's nothing spectacular about Ruth Westheimer other than the fact at the beginning of the book, the authors talked about the Soviet Union and internment camps. Well, Ruth Westheimer escaped the occupation because she was sent out of the country by her parents, but her parents perished unfortunately, in a Nazi death camp. And so, if you want to tie in the front of the book and the dedication to another potential person who appears in the back of the book, we might be talking about Ruth Westheimer. We also could be talking about Masters and Johnson. And I'm going to pull Masters and Johnson up here and give you some information about them. Because the Masters and Johnson, basically a report that came out about sex. And it was a study that was done by these two individuals. And I don't know, it became an interesting a thing. And eventually, later on, if you're familiar with if you're from that came out later, it was about the research that William Masters and Virginia Johnson had done. And so this whole thing with sexual psychology, the enjoyment of sex, and that type of thing. And the two people involved, Virginia Johnson and so her maiden name is Eshelman, and she was a sexologist. She was born in Springfield, Missouri, and she was members of the LDS Church. And the reason I bring up Virginia Johnson and her being a member of the church here is because I'm so convinced that there's a relationship to the LDS Church here. Her family moved to Palo Alto, California. So, and her father worked as a groundskeeper for a hospital. And she studied at the Kansas City Conservatory of Music. And she then launched somewhat of a music career, and she moved to St. Louis. And she became a writer for the St. Louis Daily Record. When in St. Louis, she met William H. Masters, and she met him at the Washington University in St. Louis. And he trained her in the medical terminology and had several different aspects, if you will, of their study. But anyway, they had they published basically this, research report, which a lot of psychologists, sexologists, etc., begin to use. But my point is, here I'm pointing out a back of the book potential uh, connection to the language that where we're talking about, sex, the enjoyment of sex, and all of that, which is mentioned in the section about the prudent, the pilgrim, if you will. And so I'm just pointing out that coming out of St. Louis is kind of a interesting. Um, okay, so that that's going to kind of basically get me to the end of this particular investigation. I know that somebody has put a article on a web page that explains where the photograph was taken on page 67. But I liken this photograph again because I think the brick background in this is representative of one of the puzzles. And because I think there's going to be a wall that's going to look somewhere, in a brick fashion like that. And I like the head and shoulders focus of this because in the previous one we talked about Jane Mansfield and a blonde wrestler, and this is kind of reinforcing the fact that the head and shoulders uh, in the earlier one. Um, so I guess I think that there might be some connection there to this particular location in New York, and that beak, of the bottom of that has got to be positioned in there for some reason. I have not been able to identify the face of the doll that's in this image. Honestly, it kind of looks like the scarecrow from the Wizard of Oz, but with makeup. But I don't. I mean, I haven't figured out exactly. But I do think that that's a shoe that she's shaking a a blanket or something. But to me, that actually looks like a shoe. Um, it doesn't really. I mean, what is she shaking? What is that? Uh, lady that's dressed in I don't know, some sort of Prudence looking outfit. Uh, but and again, I could be all wrong on who I came up. I mean, this could be Prudence Farrow, which was Mia Farrow's sister. Could be any number of Prudences, and it could be related to pill popping, and it might not even have anything to do with gossip. But I think it truly does have to do with gossip, and that's where I'm going to hang my hat on this one. All right, well, folks, that one I think I'm going to be done with. I'm going to take a break here, and I'll be back to talk about the Freudian sylph. Hey, Hoof, how's it going? Amy, Gwen, glad you guys could come over. I'm doing some more shows on The Secret. If you guys have The Secret book and want to follow along and provide some content, feel free. Your comments are always welcome. I'm just trying to assess The Secret, come up with who these people are in the back of the book, so we might come up with an idea of what these puzzles are about in the front of the book. So I'll be back here in a few. Thanks for joining. I'll be starting a new stream to talk about the Freudian sylphs, because I have to do a little bit more. I always have to queue up, and when I do these shows, I queue up all my tabs that I've done research on before, and then I can go back and reference them. So I got to go queue up my tabs, and then I can move forward. So anyway, I'll be back in a few. Thanks.